In this video, we're going to talk about some important topics related to using Bubble.io, the no-code app development platform, to build your no-code app. Now, these are questions we get a lot related to scaling your app, IP ownership, and more. And we're going to break all of this down today. Now, make sure you stick around until the end because, admittedly, these are things that get me a little bit fired up, and I want you to know why, because it relates to how the answers to these questions affect you and your app in the long run. So make sure you stick around. You need to hear every word of this. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help business owners and industry experts build custom apps to either start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding and with no technical background required. Now, you can sign up for our free training at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop to start building your app the right way today. So we're going to dive into some important topics. You've probably had these questions before if you're considering using Bubble.io to build your no-code app, or really if you're considering using any no-code app development platform where things like scale, IP ownership, that type of thing, where those kind of hesitations and maybe worries come up for you. So we're going to cover 4 main topic areas today in this video. One is when you decide to use Bubble, or again, any no-code app development platform, but because we primarily use Bubble, we're going to be talking about Bubble. If you decide to use it to build your app from the start, then are you stuck with the platform forever? All right, big question. So we're going to dive into that. We're going to talk about how you can handle the question of, what do you do if you don't have access to your app's source code? So when you choose to use a no-code app development platform and you can't actually access your source code, what do you do about that? Is that a big deal? Should you be concerned? We're going to talk about whether you own your IP, your intellectual property, when you're building your no-code app on Bubble or similar platforms. And we're going to talk about the big question of scale. Can you scale? What do you do when you scale? All of that. So let's dive right in. The first thing is, are you tied to Bubble if you decide to use it in the beginning? Now, this is a really big question because when you are making the decision to use a no-code app development platform, it can kind of feel like a very big commitment, right? You don't have your app yet, but you have very big plans for your app. You want to scale your app. You want to turn it into a business. Maybe you want to transition away from your current career or job or business, transition into an app-based business model, that type of thing. So when you're thinking about choosing to use Bubble, you'll want to make sure it's the right platform, because if it's not, well, what are you going to do down the road, right? Or what if Bubble doesn't maybe in the future support something that you want to do with your app? Maybe you don't have a feature in mind now, but you could have a feature later on and maybe Bubble doesn't support it. Or, what if Bubble changes in some way, right? If you're building your app on Bubble and they decide to change, maybe they're no longer Bubble anymore at some point in the future. Then what do you do, right? These things can feel really scary, to be honest, because again, you're making what feels like a really big commitment with your app. If you are worried about this, if you're worried about choosing a no-code app development platform and being tied to it, and you are not able to make the decision to actually start building your app because of that fear, I want you to think about how no matter what platform you use, no matter what language is used to build your app, no matter who builds your app, you're going to be tied to that one particular thing regardless. And if you ever wanted to change, there are going to be specific steps that you need to take regardless. So if you decide to use Bubble and then somewhere down the road for some reason, whatever it could possibly be, you decide you no longer want to use Bubble, then what do you have to do? Well, you move to something else, right? You have your app rebuilt, you rebuild your app, you move to another platform and you rebuild it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh my gosh, I don't want to get to the point of scaling and having all these users and having this business and then realizing I have to move it, right? You don't want to do that. But again, what's your alternative, right? I think that's the big question you need to be asking. If you're thinking about using Bubble, chances are there are some pretty good reasons. Bubble is giving you the capabilities you need to get your first users. That's the most important thing you need to be thinking about right now. And so if you decide to, not use Bubble because you're worried about the future, what is your alternative? How are you going to get your first users? Are you going to outsource the development of your app instead to a traditional development agency? Okay, well, you're going to be tied to whatever programming language they use. You're going to be tied to that development agency potentially, or any development agency. Maybe it's not the one you initially outsourced to, but you're going to be tied to development agencies now forever. Moving away from that, maybe someday you don't want to be tied to development agencies. Maybe someday you want more control for yourself. So then what do? Do you rebuild your app on a no-code app development platform? I mean, it could go both ways. That's what I'm trying to get at here is, yes, if you decided you wanted to move away from Bubble for some reason at some point, you'd have to rebuild your app. But the same is true regardless. And you have to think about your barrier to entry in the first place, right? How are you going to get your first users if you don't make the decision to use Bubble? That's my big question for you. And I think it hangs a lot of people up. They don't want to move forward because they're so worried about the future. So they're trying to figure out, okay, maybe there's a different development platform. Maybe I should go with traditional programming. Yeah, but there's pros and cons to everything, right? So think about what's going to make it easiest for you to reach your first goal of actually having users in the first place. Because right now, you're just thinking hypothetically. Maybe you want to move away from this platform in the future, but maybe not. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? You rebuild. That can happen with pretty much anything. What's the best that can happen? Well, now you have an app and a business a whole heck of a lot sooner. So that's how I would think of it. And that's how I would move forward. Now, to be clear, if you did have to move off of any development platform you choose or anything that you use, if at some point in the future you decided to move, well, with Bubble in particular, you own your data, right? You don't have your source code itself. And that's the scary thing for a lot of people. But again, think about the alternatives. Like it's just, how can you reach your first goal of getting users, and how can you do that in the best way possible? And can you help yourself or try to force yourself not to think about potentially moving in the future and letting that hold you back from even getting users in the first place? Okay, so we'll leave that one there. Okay, so hopefully that helps you in that particular decision-making process. Now, this leads us into the next big question of, what do you do when you don't have access to your source code? Right now, this is a big and scary thing for a lot of people, and for, again, a similar reason, because if for some reason you did want to move off of Bubble, well, it's not as easy as just taking your app and moving it somewhere else and then just carrying on, right? Because you don't have access to your app's source code. Now, I mentioned your data is yours, and we'll get to your IP in just a minute, but with your source code. Now, to be clear, we do have a full video going into just this one topic alone, so we won't do a complete deep dive here, but I do want to cover some things that'll help you with this. So if you're scared, or if you're worried to build your app on Bubble because you don't have access to your source code, I want you to think about it from a different perspective. Okay, not having access to your source code means that you don't have to manage it. Now, remember, we talked about, can you lower your barrier to entry into having an app and an app-based business in the first place? All right, worrying about all the long-term things keeps that barrier pretty high, but thinking about the immediate, you can really lower it if you leverage no-code tools like Bubble. Now with Bubble, because you're not managing your source code, that means that you don't have to deal with your own servers. You don't have to deal with your setting up your own file storage. You can have really quick domain connection. You have an entire way to structure and build and house your own data within your actual app on Bubble, right? You don't have to do any of the programming, the coding, right? Using Bubble, yeah, you don't have access to your source code, but there are so many benefits that you get by not having to manage your source code. You're getting to use a platform that is already built for you. It's packaged up nicely. It essentially creates the foundation, the framework of your application. All you have to do is build on top of that. And you don't have to be tied to developers forever. You don't have to manage all those nitty gritty little granular things that if you're a non-tech entrepreneur, you probably don't know how to do a lot of that stuff. And truthfully, you probably don't care to know either, right? So you don't have to do that when you use something like Bubble. So, okay, you don't have access to your source code. Well, what if you want to move off the platform later? You can't just kind of port your app out. Well, we talked about this in the last one in being tied to the platform or having the concern of being tied to the platform. Keep in mind that if you ever got to the point where you have this big, fully fledged app, it's your full scope app, you have lots of users, you're monetizing it, you have your business, you've moved away from your current job, like life is good, you have this new app-based business model, or maybe you're scaling your existing business with an app. If you're at that point and you have to move your app for some reason, for some hypothetical reason, is it really going to be that big of a problem? I mean, think about all the tools you use. If you're using business tools, for example, think about how much of your business lives on tons of different tools. Moving away from any of them, it's a task. You have to do it. It can be tedious. You might need to hire someone to help you move, but this is the same for any type of platform. No matter where you're building your app, if you want to move at some point, you have to do the same, right? And so with Bubble, fortunately, if you did want to move, well, you do have your data. And with Bubble, it lowers the barrier to entry so much that what are you really losing? Is it that big compared to how much just leveraging Bubble compresses your time frame of having that business in the first place, right? So you just have to change your perspective a little bit. And instead of thinking, oh my gosh, what if all these things happen in the future? Well, I mean, what are you going to do in the immediate and the alternative, right? Leverage these tools that let you actually achieve the things that would even potentially bring about the problems that you're worrying about in the future in the first place. So don't have access to your source code. Is it really that big of a deal? What's the worst, really? So I encourage you to think about the future, actually put yourself in the situation where that could be an issue. And that problem is going to seem a lot smaller, right, than it does right now. So hopefully that helps you. But again, we have a whole video on the source code topic that you can check out to do a deeper dive if that's one of your main worries. So the next one is IP. Your intellectual property. Do you own it if you're building your app on Bubble? This is something that I see a lot of people asking, and I think it stems from them sort of assuming that if you're building your app on a platform, that platform technically owns your app. And that's not the case. So you can monetize your app however you want. Bubble is a platform. So if you are using Bubble and you are on one of their plans, then you're paying Bubble for one of their plans. You're paying them to be able to leverage their platform, but they don't own your intellectual property, right? Your data is yours, your app is yours. Again, you can monetize it however you want. Bubble just owns the platform the same as any other platform. I mean, WordPress doesn't own all of the websites all the intellectual property from the entrepreneurs who are building their websites on WordPress. It's kind of the same thing. In Bubble's documentation, they even talk about this, and they liken it to using Microsoft Word to write a best-selling novel. Microsoft doesn't own your novel. They just own their platform that you chose to use as your writing tool. So do you own your IP? Yes, you can monetize your app however you want. That's up to you. So that should be a pretty easy one. I think this is more so one where people just have the question. You might have this question and you kind of just need a simple answer. So this is the same. You're paying Bubble to use the platform, but they don't actually own your intellectual property. So the last question it relates to scalability. Now, this is the big one. This is the one that the most people have concerns about. And this is one that definitely gets me fired up a little bit to talk about it, because it's so misunderstood. And because it's misunderstood, it holds so many people back from having the apps and businesses they otherwise could. And to me, that's a real shame. So is your app going to be scalable? What happens when you scale? Can you scale? And we have talked about this in lots of other videos, just in different ways, but it comes down to how you build the app. No matter what platform you're using or what language you're using, you can build an unscalable app, right? That's no different with Bubble. You can build an unscalable app on Bubble, and you may have seen people talking about having unscalable apps. Maybe you've seen those apps yourself and you're left thinking, oh my gosh, like I don't want to build an app like that. Well, can you see behind the scenes, or are you looking behind the scenes? Do you know how to build a scalable app in the first place? Again, you can build an unscalable app no matter what tools or language you're using. A lot of this comes down to whether or not you are actually taking steps to make your app scalable. There's so much more to it than just using the tool, right? You actually have to put some strategy into it. You have to use the tool in the right way. This is the same for, anything. Think about, walk out into your garage and pick up any tool. If you don't know how to use it correctly, then you're probably not going to do a very good job with, whatever project you're working on. It's not the tool's fault, right? You just have to know how to use it. So can you create a scalable app? Yeah, you can. Can you create an unscalable app? Yes, you can. So you have to know how to use the tool correctly, and that is up to you, okay? Now, what I want you to also think about, and this is a really big one, is, and this is also kind of a running theme just with everything, but if you are so worried that your app isn't going to be scalable, that you decide not to move forward and just build your app in the first place, what are you accomplishing? Right? What are you even achieving? You are holding yourself back from actually having the app and the business that you want, simply because you're worried that you will get to a point of achieving success and then all of a sudden your app just isn't going to work anymore. Newsflash, you have to actually get there first, right? For that to even be a possibility. Okay, right now, if this is your concern, you are assuming that your app is going to be a wild success and that you're going to have, thousands of users. Or if you're not, if you're thinking about scalability less from a user standpoint and more just from a load standpoint, you are making the assumption that is just a done deal. You and your app, you're going to be successful, and you know this before you have even started building it. Now, I like the optimism. I think you should be driven, and I think you should be driven for success, because otherwise, what's the point? But don't make a decision because you're worried about something that truthfully might not happen. If you're worried about the wrong things at the wrong times, then you're never going to be able to take the right first steps. You have to take steps to actually get to the point where that could potentially even ever hypothetically be a problem. Okay, so instead of thinking about, oh, should I start building my app just in case when I have 100,000 users, this one thing might happen? Or should you be thinking, how do I get my first users that are going to validate my product and help me create an actual business? How am I going to get my first users to allow me to monetize this app? That's what I would personally think about, because otherwise, what is your alternative, right? That's what I keep coming back to. And that's really what I want you to think about. If you're worried about the future, about these hypothetical scenarios, what is your alternative? Most people don't think about this, right? They go through the options and they think, oh, this isn't going to work because this could happen, or this isn't going to work, right? And they just kind of work their way through the options until maybe there aren't any left, or maybe the only one left is to just say, well, I'm going to outsource to a traditional development agency and let them handle it all. But if that's the alternative, well, do you have the budget for that? Do you want to manage a project like that? Do you have the time frame for that? Do you have the budget for that for the entire lifetime of your app? Because you're never going to be able to move away from that unless you decide to rebuild your app on a no-code platform, which is what we see a lot of people doing, so that they can have the control. So what's the alternative? And if you go down that alternate route, is it going to just loop you back right to where you're starting now? That's what I would ask yourself. Okay, why hold yourself back from success by worrying about these hypothetical situations? Now, I do want to say that I understand the fears and the worries. I've been there too. And even though I know all of these things, and even though I'm standing here telling you all of these things today, I still, these things creep into the back of my mind, because we're all humans, right? And you want to make sure you're making the right decisions. And when there are uncertainties and unknowns around those decisions, anxiety, right? It's just a natural thing. I understand it, but I want you to understand that if you are holding yourself back from ever actually getting to the point where any of these things could even hypothetically be an issue, then you are limiting yourself. You are holding yourself back from ever seeing the success that right now you're just assuming is going to happen. So I would think through these things. Are you tied to the platform? Yeah, you can't take your source code off. Is that really that big of a deal, right? What's the alternative? Okay. And then to build on that, if you don't have your source code, what's the alternative? And is it really that big of a deal after thinking through everything that we talked about today? If you're worried about not owning your IP or being able to monetize your app however you want, hopefully that is clear for you. You do have to pay for a Bubble plan if you want, if you're obviously serious about building your app, but it's your app, it's your intellectual property. And what about scale? Can you scale? What happens when you scale? Well, yes, you can, but also, yes, you can't if you build your app in the wrong way. And what happens when you scale? Well, you keep going. If hypothetically you ever decided to move away for some reason, congratulations, good job. You now have a business, and taking those first steps in order to get there are the most important. So I hope this is helpful for you. And if you are moving forward with your no-code app, if you're wanting to use Bubble, which is a really powerful platform that we really like to use, we have a free workshop over at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop. And it's going to guide you through some of the initial strategic steps with your app, making sure you're building the right things at the right time. It's going to talk about Bubble, different ways that you can use the tool. And really, it's just going to help you get started with your app in the right way. So if you haven't started yet, or if you have started, but you want to make sure you're doing everything correctly, then head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop and check that out. Again, I hope this is helpful for you. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.